those first few minutes. The whole spectrum of decomposing vegetation was reflected in the dusty brown brickwork, the cucumber green pillar boxes, the banana yellow facade of a pub. The buses were milk chocolate and cream, and the rest of the colour scale was filled in by turquoise miniskirts and lime green hipster jeans, obsolete fashions to my eye that seemed to have taken several years to cross the sea from Carnaby Street. I had the feeling of entering the city through the back door by way of an overgrown kitchen garden and stepping straight into its garrulous private life. Connolly was obviously the main terminal for the north, but its modest scale and its distance from the centre made it seem reassuringly provincial. It seemed to doze off in the long intervals between trains, and the reception it had offered me was strikingly casual compared with the self-important bustle and roar of Euston or the Gare du Nord. There were no grumbling bus convoys, no taxi queues or touts, no pompous hotel facades or fast food outlets. No one had examined my passport or my luggage at the border. No one met me by arrangement. I'd been slow to leave the train, and the station had been almost deserted by the time I checked my suitcase into the left luggage office. I'd arrived in the country unidentified and unannounced, and my presence attracted so little attention that I soon felt as inconspicuous as a native. When I entered a pub called McCormack's, two old men shifted along the counter with a friendly nod to make space for my elbow and carried on with their conversation as if I were a neighbour entitled to eavesdrop. They were engaged in a mildly acrimonious dispute about racehorses. Sure, didn't that Harry Green Clover was a dead last? 18-1 for the love of Jesus. You must have been fucking locked. I was never locked. 2 points I had, not a drop over. I was savouring the sound of the speech more than the sense. Its soft consonants and undulant nasal vowels made Glasgow pub talk sound like a clash of rasps and flick knives, and it flowed into my ear as smoothly as the brimming cream of the stout filled my mouth. When I drunk Guinness in Glasgow in the very few dockside pubs that knew how to serve it, I was aware that its true flavour and texture don't survive export, but I'd forgotten just how much richer and maltier it tastes in situ. And I can hardly overstate the intensity of that sensation of swallowing the fermented essence of Dublin. I thought of it as the Douve Linn, the dark pool at the origin of the name. And its ideal setting was the dense, fuggy twilight of this wood-panelled bar amid the intimate rumble of gossip and desultory argument. I was rediscovering the indefinable, smoky undertaste that lasts till the bottom of the glass, like the rings of foam that mark the extent of every mouthful with archaeological precision. After the clear, frothy, hard-edged beers of Scotland, which seemed to quicken our tempers and sharpen our voices, I'd begun to see Irish stout as a liquid metaphor for the slower, mellower, and more opaque Irish nature. To be drinking legally at all in a public house on a Sunday evening, when every pub in Scotland was sullenly shuttered and locked, was a circumstance that felt like the epitome of luxury and civilization.
That's really interesting. I can see, I saw you as well, Breathe. You can really see an old Dublin there, can't you?
I love how you spoke about stout.
Anybody want to have a chat before we go on to, or do you want to do any more reading? Would you like me to show some of your images just now, or?
Well, you could put the picture of the Merchant's Arch.
Yeah, I'll just try and find that one now. Oh, good, it's the one that's coming up. Perfect. So this is the cover of the book, yeah. And Gerald Mangan was beginning to make a reputation as a poet and artist at the age of 20 when he left his native Glasgow to seek a living in Dublin. One Bed This Night is a memoir of his extraordinary journey through a now vanished world of doss houses, cattle boats, dole queues, and smoky literary pubs. It records his upward progress from itinerant busker and factory labourer to the rewards of patronage and recognition, which of course tonight is part of.
Of course.
Yeah, it's a great image. Do you want to talk us through who this is McDade's, for those of you who hung around the Stephen's Green part of Dublin? Well known, like it wasn't well known for women, I have to say, was it?
Well, there were quite a number of women there. I mean, there was although it was predominantly masculine. Yeah, it was in Harry Street. I just knew it for one winter, in fact, before the clientele moved en masse to Grogan's in South William Street, because the place was auctioned, and Pat O'Brien, who was the manager, decided that he didn't want to stay. So it was a case, as was famously said at the time, of the rats deserting the sinking ship. So that's a portrait of it as I knew it at that time, but painted in retrospect. You need a key to do the whole thing, but you can see Pierce Hutchinson there, and Eddie Linden is in there too. Anthony Cronin, my supposed ancestor James Clarence Mangan is there as a ghost in the background.
Yes, of course, yeah.
But you have to get a zoom on that.
Now, did you say that Hayden Murphy was in here somewhere too?
Yeah, McDarrah Woods with the moustache is right in the middle there. He's holding up his arm.
Right, so Hayden is behind him.
And Hayden is behind him speaking to Elaine Quillinine.
But had Hayden got rid of his ponytail by then? I thought he still would have had his ponytail at that time.
No, he didn't.
I remembered him going around the pubs of Dublin with a leather satchel over his shoulder, selling his broadsheets.
Right, yeah, he was very courageous about that.
Yeah, he was
going everywhere, selling it. He did a good job of it too. I mean, it was wonderful.
Oh yes, it was very successful. Yeah. Did you know that those broadsheets are in the National Library of Scotland?
Yeah, in fact,
they're here.
In fact, there's a poem of mine in that collection, of which I
we'll have to, maybe for one of these literary celebrations at another point, when the world can open up a little bit more, it might be really nice to go into the library and get one of the curators to let us see all that stuff. Which they do. They're very helpful. They really like to do that kind of engagement stuff.
Yeah, I was just saying that's actually got a copy of a poem of which I don't have a copy myself. It'd be useful to get in there to get a copy of it back again. Hayden actually kept a manuscript copy, which was on display. But yeah, I mean, he was the first editor in Ireland to actually ask me for my work. Not just the poems, but drawings as well. Do you want to read another wee bit?
Yeah, that would be lovely.
It's the next episode. After Talbot Street, I went into a pub and got some directions for bed and breakfasts from a man who directed me to Westland Row, which I'd never heard of before. On Westland Row, across from a railway station that looked even sleepier than Connolly, the only B&B that wasn't displaying a no vacancies notice was a place that called itself Carmel House. I swung the brass knocker just one step up from the pavement, and the door creaked ajar after a very long interval with a fussy rattle of chains. An odd mixture of odours wafted out of face powder and wax polish and burnt soup. A small elderly woman peered out through the 6-inch gap around the level of my abdomen, tilting her face at an almost horizontal angle in order to scrutinise me with both eyes. She was wearing a flower-encrusted hat as if she were dressed for evening mass. I asked if she had any vacancies, and she said, 4. I stared blankly for a moment before venturing a guess at her meaning. For tonight? No, she clucked irritably. Who for? Vacancies for whom? If for me. Not you and your wife. I glanced instinctively over my shoulder. No, just me. I thought you were going to say me and my wife. There's any number comes around here looking for a room and they say me and my wife, and it's not their wife at all. It's somebody else's wife. Well, you needn't worry. I don't have a wife. I can't be having none of that, you see, not in my house. However, that's neither here nor there. Would you be looking for a breakfast? I couldn't be giving you breakfast. Well, that wouldn't matter if the price was reasonable. Oh, it's reasonable, all right. You can rest assured, more than reasonable. I'm just thinking of yourself, you see. By the time you've paid for a bed here and a breakfast somewhere else, you might think you're better off not staying here at all. Do you see what I mean? That's why I'm not pushing myself, like. I see, yes. Does that mean that you do have a vacancy? Only to share. There's a bed, all right, but you'd have to share the room with an elderly gent, and he's a bit cantankerous and over fond of his bottle, confidentially. He's not back till all hours some nights, and he makes a holy ruckus sometimes when he does, tripping over the hall stand and what have you. I don't know as you'd be comfortable. No, maybe not. You'd be better trying Mrs. Lynch around the corner. It sounds like it. Mrs. Lynch was a younger woman who came to the door more briskly, wiping her floury hands on a wraparound smock, but her house was also full up. When I tried to soften her with some tentative cajolery, informing her that my grandmother was a Lynch from Donegal, she closed the door with a polite apology, saying that she had a cake in the oven and 4 children to put to bed. By the time 2 dingier establishments along Pierce Street had drawn a similar blank, I had retraced my steps as far as the railings of Trinity College, where the crowd on the pavement seemed to be a confluence of late churchgoers and younger cinema-goers. I noticed a group of mini-skirted teenagers giggling furtively behind a pair of poker-faced nuns, and I had a sudden dismal impression that I was the only person in the city who was out walking unaccompanied without a bed in prospect for the night.
Very good.
Just, it's so vivid. It's such a vivid description of Dublin. How long did you stay there, Jerry?
In Dublin itself, about 2 years. In various parts. My first
I was
flat
just going to
was
say you picked up the accent and the intonation really well. Made me think you'd lived there much longer.
Oh yeah, well, I worked as a voice coach for a while.
Oh right, okay.
A lot of people can't get Dublin accents. I actually gave lessons to Leonard Maguire once, when he was doing Juno and the Peacock, and with a Belfast accent, which was totally inappropriate. I was continually taken for someone from the north. I mean, it's quite a common experience, I think, for Scots in Dublin. They say, "Are you from the north?" And of course, the first time I was asked that, I said, "Yeah, I'm from Scotland." But that's not what they meant. They didn't mean the compass point. They meant the province, you know. So.
So that even happens when you come from Edinburgh to Dublin. I think you come from the north.
Yeah, I think from anywhere north. Yeah, anywhere north of Swords. You know, I think it's
quite possibly.
Yeah.
Would you like to take a wee breather and we can hear from Oisín, or would you rather carry on?
Oh yeah, sure. I mean, I'm very willing for a rest.
Yeah. Well, Oisín, would you want to unmute yourself, and I'll roll back these guys. Here we are. So.
Okay.
So. Where we began.
Yeah. Where do we start with this then? I suppose.
Congratulations on your lockdown first collection, full first collection of poetry. Although you've had your work published over the years, haven't you? But this is your first standalone collection, and there was going to be a real live launch of the book.
Yeah.
But COVID had other ideas.
Yep.
So in week 1 of lockdown, there was probably the first ever live Facebook event I've attended. And he's had some great reviews. And I just picked up on a few of the interesting things. Like, I mean, I could have gone for just the complimentary ones, but there was a lot of depth to these ones, I thought. An ambitious book in epic style, Breen consciously places the work outside the realm of the contemporary poetic style. This choice is a bold one, but it fits naturally within the fabric of the work. I thought that was great because it was that's not false praise of any kind. And then also Books Ireland magazine was a good one. What you're trying to do, while not utterly new stylistically, is absolutely refreshing and at least as importantly thought-provoking. Thought that was great. So he was praising the publisher as much as you.
Yep.
For just getting it out there and sharing your work, which I think is probably enough blether from me. You might want to just oh yeah, except that there was this other one. This was a Cornish, it was a Cornish writer, Lawrence Ilsey. I thought that was interesting, who now lives in Wales. So he seemed to have a real sense of the deeper kind of the roots of your work, really. So talking about one of the pieces, because these are all long form pieces of poetry, that he thought that Dublin and the loose footwork of Deity was possibly the strongest work there, again firmly rooted in Dublin. So I thought this would be really nice, just to go straight into another firmly rooted in Dublin piece from a very different perspective.
Absolutely.
So, I'd rather hear from you than from what other people think of you.
Well, I mean, it's nice to have other people thinking of me, Hopefully one day I'll keep everyone
especially
else
in
away.
these strange days. Now, don't tell me that's milk you're drinking, Oisín. I'm worrying about
No, it's Pernod.
Oh, that's okay. That's all right. Phew.
Right, yeah, so let's see, I suppose I should start with a caveat, which is that for those who have not heard me read, which is most of you, not all of you, they're long. So be prepared for a lengthy journey rather than a momentary wander. These do take a little while, so please do bear with me. Oh, hang on, while I also seem to have accidentally rotated things. So normally I would read from paper, but today there was a bit of, I suppose semi-breaking news for work that I needed to wrap up an article for. So I was doing that all day, so I didn't have time to go get things printed out, that sort of thing. So, right, what I'm going to read is something that was actually inspired by the man in the image there as Donal O'Keefe. Donal had a very sad thing happen to him, tragic, sad, it was to do with the passing of his mother. And I did check with him that this was okay. And it was when I suppose the whole thing hit him, it was, I was there, thankfully, to be able to give him a hug, which was great. But I saw the pain, and the pain, I suppose, just struck me like a kind of an early death mask on someone, and I wanted to capture it. But I also wanted to capture it while thinking about, I suppose, representations of death of women, how women often get marginalized, even in, I suppose, lamentation as mothers rather than also sexual beings, young people, sleeping around when they're 17, drinking cans of cheap cider under a bridge. The whole aspect, rather than just to focusing on the motherhood, which bothered me somewhat. So that's why I wrote this. So it's called Lilies on the Deathbed of a Time. So again, normally I would do this standing up, but the camera isn't quite set for that. So without further ado, here we go. Lilies on the Deathbed of a Time. All this ends with the hocking of soft skin and loose folds, a solemn current of spooled ink, a stuffed portent, that elegiac parchment of cause and effect and rhapsody, where each stroke of the hand is delicate enchantment. Yet, like stripling vines in stupor, we rest ourselves from a standing start, only so as to glut ourselves keening in the play of rustling air. And like children caught in first blush, at rush to gorge our nascent wanting, we relentlessly feast on the contingencies to differentiate stone from stave. But the salted oceans we pillage render up scant grain, and illumination is in death annihilation, and the hard sense of knowing, curtain fall and the committal. How I long then for the pure milk of the word, how I long then for the fine new of the wood, a caress wet with a tongue full of discarded apocryphae, though as I imagine her, the softness and the hardness, the headiness and the fineness, her eyes, age writ in the bark of an unhallowed kindness, and ground in an omerta of forgetting, as I imagine her, she who was always the first, she who was poisonous, bearing bright red fruit, Yoho driving her crown unknowing into her wounds. Ah, Christ, as I imagine it, cleaved from her, this is the loss of plenty. This too is a choral reliquary, a continuum in 3 parts, repetition and a long, harsh residue of sweetness and light, hard lie, asphalt dye, and a mercantile air, and an inching juggernaut of vapor. This is the laughing melancholia of the depths, where songbirds describe our stuttered movements, with heavy breath and patternings of plucked strings, abeyance, and the heat undoes me. Yet here, murmurations and sowherds mingle at rest upon the rocks, jagged flagstones with fire beneath, with them rent, a holiness of measure, a panacea for the lengthiness of weight, for the edifying stillness of the grave. And here too, Balia and Eileen in grief's pallor leave each other scalp likenesses, eyeless messages hooked in a tangle of bark-spattered joins. And sure, the last picture I have of me uncle, like, you know, he's all dolled up like Napoleon Bonaparte, I says. And sure, that the hard ceramics at the end of the stacks of the dead, they give me shivers, he says. And sure, you know, when I saw the man himself sundered and wailing, you know, when she, Sharna reminisce, gobbled up the last of her air, wasn't I half heartbroken and half in love, I asks. But the only time I cried at a funeral was for someone I never really knew. Yet the seasons mingle with the Boyne's black waters, where once the sun stood still for 9 months to placate the husband of the white cow, Buvinda. For Angus, his birthright, the Brug na Boyne, starfire on the longest day, for the thorn-struck blindness of Midir. For each of us it differs. Angus paid with the body of Etine, his horror Fuamnach, who sponny time to water, worm and scarlet fly, his reprieve, her second birth in her 1,000th year, his sentence, ho, Fuamnach lost her head. But for each of us it differs. But our death will come in a single reckoning, a blow that shakes us from navel to heart, a furious meeting of synapses, riffing out sketches in a stop-start-stop algorithmic play, all at once and not at once. And I have been dying for such a long time. 2. There is, however, a verse that is incumbent on us to repeat, of blessed hunger and enduring until we die. But I long for the pure milk of the word. I long for the fine young ewe of the wood, a caress softly indulgent, and yet without measure, a kiss shared at Dromore Bridge. But it is beyond me, and it is winter now, and you, the young, must leave the old bereft. Theirs is a rapture of russet, of left-behind apricot seeds, a litany of gyres, levers, and warning sides. Thus the levee skirls with white noise and elan, for here in the dark light where prohibition becomes license, here there is death, the one true vision of abundance. Thus I keep traces of their names in the gabbardle of the arrowstalk, in hexagrams, so as to lay down the power of them in memory, to cut the words of them in 8 parts for the wooing of Etine, to venerate them and the shame of their cold blood, to salute the traces of scarlet on their breasts. And well I remember when I first saw her, bright silver she was, hair like a blooming iris, a beautiful painted corpse. And after her second birth, she wed Yokuarim, but his brother wept for want of her, till Midir tore him from his frame and took her 3 times. So now you are my constant companion, and I have made you a small chamber so that you might come and go. And now I tell you, this wet soil from which I fashioned you a sleeping coat, it is heavy with mealworms. This heat of yours, it will fire my body, this instrument of lilies. 3. I tell you yet, though, it came at a single reckoning, a blow that shook me from the navel to the heart, a furious meeting of synapses, riffing out sketches of a stop-start-stop algorithmic play. It was all at once and not at once, so I tell you, I have been dying for such a long time, and I have seen its end. It was like moss on the south face of the wall in the northern hemisphere, or thyme growing errantly on a windowsill opposite where you have your morning coffee, that hard gable grinding earthiness tapping out notes of odour on a punch clock upon which time maps out not the limp, unforgiving sermon of the wasted hours, but an aria of 3-foot weather-worn signage that recounts all the places we had been and loved, where pigeons pecked the grains on the grey cement, and old men supped soup through fruit-flecked beards, telling each other, sure, if they did shite, they'd laugh me whole off. You know, he was there, and, you know, it's ridiculous. Like 22-year-olds chatting me up, you know, he's just, you know, you'll have to ask him, but like, here she comes. Or it was the scoliosis stitches up beautiful women into the shape of feuding Christmas birds, and where I once sat hammering out inconsistencies, where others fled to the soft arms of pretty girls as a means to find a rum-soaked, chin-splitting escape that happened to the clock every 14 years, where I held hands and felt whole, totally and utterly whole. It was like following a raggedy dog with the tremors, its panting breath overdue, but unwilling to sunder itself from loving, even while lost in the thorny mountains of Northern California, or the kind of idle happenstance that leaves you wildly obsessing over the beauty of someone, knowing they're all caught up in the same mutual eulogy of brittle hunger and the sharp, fast hangdog wasting into wanton for a taste or a bite on the slenderness of the nape of a neck or a shoulder, wildly too aware that now is not the right time, for you're already in love, though it's the right time for them for you, and not for them. So you go on wanting and asympathetic rhythm. So you might as well just fill yourself hoarse in the fluttering breeze of the moments when you almost meet. Oh, time, or the day. Do you remember the day you were sitting at home, drawn in a picture book, till your father lifted you up and threw you out the front door, telling you how the sun is a haven that spares you from regret, and this led you to roam until as the sun climbed down from its screeching perch, and you went to gather flowers to give to your mother on time for tea, only to be met by her howling, and you were gone, and she didn't know why, she didn't know where, and she was chewed up by the fear that you'd be gone before her. It was like the faint memory of a jolting, shuddering heave that left me in the back of a car, covered in broken glass and drowning in purple beet stains, after a bus clattered into the back of us, and we were on the way to the Centre for the Deaf, for I could not hear, but then seeing the faces of my mother and the driver convulsed into the rotten death masks of Neolithic soldiers, burned for fire, for they saw death, a shattered husk in its infancy, torn from life by nothing other than the steady melody of idle chants, and it was like us laughing together, her having heaved me from herself and then stunned me, first with her wisdom, then with her ignorance. Yet though it came in a single reckoning, a blow that shook me from the navel to the heart, a furious meeting of synapses riffing out sketches of a stop-start, stop algorithmic play. It was all at once and not at once, and I have been dying for such a long time. This then is the mulch, the one true elegy to the halter and the hare. This is the silence of cacophony, the threnody to a saturated life, where Yaku Harim was forced to choose his wife from 50, where, ignorant of her after decades long spent wanting the sight of her, with her plump with child, this is where he chose instead his own daughter as his bride. This is where she bore his last son and then watched her husband father burn. She the mes bukala, as is written in the yellow book of Lakal. Here then, the beast is holy, the har is holy, and holy too is the red honey, the lips, each other's, especially yours, for which I have such a thirst. 4. But now, the air outside us is sharp and heavy with moisture, and we start to walk, and we match each other's rhythm, a pair of lust-drunk metronomes. We're getting to know you better is the unthreading of a well-worn coat, and gripping your waist thrills. Ardor, never having realized the reach of one arm swallows you, or how small that makes you, and how hungry that makes me. And I am so very hungry. It is October, late in the month. It is always dark here. Sometimes the darkness flees fulsomely, anxiously. Others it hangs on your eyelids like heat, exciting, soporific, but most of all an incantation to burrow into each other's skin. It is late October, and we walk in syncopated beats until we stop, until we cannot stop. I turn to you, or you turn to me, or is it that we both just turn to each other? And I don't want to say, and neither do you. Think instead of when a person looks at the stars on a clear night, far from the city. It's so different. In the desert, sand noticeably cooling underfoot, you retreating to the fire, it differs too. There the sky is a hearth full of embers and surging starlight, pulsars slashing at the skin of the coarse grain, and a muddy filament lovingly wiped clean with a sweaty rag. The sky ruptures into tendentious play for infinitude, where every star visible to the naked eye ushers in another in a finite but uncountable distribution of connection. But your eyes, they do not unsheathe stars. Instead, I see the sclera held tight in a pink and muddy pair of lids, softened by brushed browns and purples, irises refracting into ash, and pupils sharp as needle points, expanding and contracting like the beaten wings of an antler moth, a seductive scansion of the unuttered, driven by fibrous muscle and blood in a trabecular meshwork exhaling reservoirs of stillness and thought. But when I see this, I see also a fluid lattice composed of fixed points and fixed rotations, entangled in the rupture, engulfing your watchfulness with light, thought, and wanting. And as I turn to you, the patterns fuse in lockstep, and the syncopated beat of doubled movement stalled instead becomes a diffusion of caterwauling rapture in the humming of shared sight. It is October, and the cold, humid air embalms your night grey skin in a raised relief of plucked paws, tautened sinews, and erubescent cheeks. It is October, and I loosen the slack of my grip, almost shaking you free of me, leaving my palm resting on the top of your hip and my fingers feather-like, roiling the damp air just above your skin, a soft breeze through friction and an insistence of momentary sensation that is almost, but not quite, touch. And then you nearly buck, first at the sudden slackness and then at the shivering and forcing into the small of your back, heavier now, twisting into a contrapposto pendulum of hip pressed with hip, hands now touching each other's waists, us turning into each other from side to side, circling through side, listing under the light and the air and the dawning weight of closeness, of smells, of colour and taste. Now think, when you watch a candle, its balletic fire, a torrent of seemingly unending heat, a sharp fixed point of gulped air, silence meets a breathless rhapsody of death. There are instants of stillness, moments where the flame flickers out, then continues, they backed by equal moments of surging light, where blue flickers in milliseconds, venomously cohere, then vanish, a traceless soliloquy of continuance. Now think of when you fall into lockstep together, a shared pattern of touch and thirst. There too exists a tumult, a withering and blooming of stopped hearts, and it coils around you until you become inseparable from its center, and your touch becomes theirs and their touch another's, and the distance between you is impossible to maintain. And there is tension, your whole body a trap, primed, and you need to, and you have to, and you ought to, and you should do, and you will do, and you must find release. And when you do, I flickers out, then continues. And then there is the light. There is nothing else but the having and the being had. And everything vanishes in the desperate cerise, pressed lips and curled lips and rolling tongues, the pressure of hands on your neck, on your back, on the nape, on the back of your head, running down the side gently of your face, and the light that is pulsing, or your chest, or your breast, to your hips, and there is nothing else but the having and being had, and you vanish into the parenthesis of pressure of lolling tongues and flaring nerve endings, interconnected, and the light, it is blinding. There is always that continuance, that message, I want, and further touch, and the light, I am reeling, and you are locked now, not in moments, but in need, and the light, it is everywhere, and in the insatiable thrill of having, of you, and you have, and you do, and you must have more, you do, and you drink, and you must. It is October, and the sharp sting of frozen wind electrifies and traces in tandem with your tongue the small creases of age between my shoulder and my neck. It is October, and we are drinking from each other, and it is impossible to stop. 5. Yet I am, I was, I will be, and I will not be. The same is true for you. We are born and we die, and she is, she was, she will be, and she will not be. And this is as true for our mothers as it is for our fathers. Everyone we love must die. Know then that grief enacts its pallor on us relentlessly. Death is a snare, we the trapped hair, senses in lieu of limbs bared like torn muscle and steel jaw traps, suffering under a merciless gloaming of the soul that racks even the flesh of children at play. They in pirouettes, those shadow dances in the dusk of harvest time, realizing rising in one long day, they'll race each other's heartbeats to a standstill, pull flecks of hay from each other's temples, laughing. Then one of each pair will fatten with the weight of another marked utterance of life, wrought unto being, for they, like us, hairish, watch the fires burn, trap snap shut, senses in lieu of limbs, racked with a fulsome distemper, with each mile fled marked by a funereal stone. But one marker is harder to traverse than the rest, because when your mother dies, the tether snaps and you know something is gone that will never return. But in loss, there is also the renaissance of stillness, one heartbeat in which to live, one vision, one mind, and a coalescence, our footsteps illumined by what we may yet become. So with one heartbeat, one steady moment of exultant pleasure, in rapture, I am become the sum of my parts, and beyond it, the end and you to end. And I traipse idly with the same pitter-patter mind as the marsh tits that scavenge for scraps at the top of Leith Walk, rambling down Broughton Street and East Claremont Street and St. Mark's Path, over the water, thinking of the great stone bridge, and when you drink the waters to stave off the scythe, death schlepping myself down Warriston Road, accompanied by the sound of screeching gulls. And here, by Crow Bridge, her red shoes and the frame of purple stone guarding the twilight, I like to walk. It is peaceful, after all, here among the dead. Those who come to mourn show their rent hearts at their openmost in sight. And here I once saw the face of God. Here Alilangubai, brother of Yokuarin, split himself into sherds to leave a portion of himself always watching over the shoulder, always watching over their mother, she who died of grief and memory loss after the burning of her second son. Here Alil stands vigil, and once when I went to the crematorium, I saw him, God-struck. His is the face of God and the lamenting voice of the pilgrim's song. He was laughing, telling stories about her, and he couldn't stop smiling. Then the curtain fell, the committal. Then he fell, he snapped, he a twig under the hunter's boot, he a reed torn by a careless child, he later gathered by a mother duck to build a nest for her young, he bereft of she beyond forgetting, she who had through illness long since forgotten him, she whose love was without end until it was pregnant with ending and imbued of ash. So at one heartbeat, one steady moment of exultant pleasure, in rapture, I am become the sum of stars, and beyond it the end and you to end. He fell, motherless, motherless, he fell, and I have never seen anything so beautiful. 6, and the last section. It was beautiful the day she died. She barely spoke, but when she did, she asked after her childhood friends. And I told her they were all long dead, and she the last. All dead, buried beneath the Brug na Boine. Angus, he was starfire on the longest day. The white cow Bulvinda, thorn-struck blind amid the air, and mad Fuamnach of the water worm and scarlet flight. Even Yokuarim and his brother Alilangubai, he who split into sherds, a portion of himself at vigil to wait for the passing of time. All dead, and there I stood at vigil in the resting place of the face of God. And she sang then for childhood of whooper swans and potchards, tufted ducks and common terns, curlews, buzzards, ring-necked ducks and buff-bellied pipits, sandpipers, great-crested grebes and blackcaps, heron, peeweeps, tree-wheat creepers and the water rail. She sang too of the pipit's soft electric whistle and the inching hoarse-whinny trill of the little grebe. And I, half mad with grief, was convinced her final gasp was to be an epiphany. But at her last, she was displaced in time, each epiphany into parts, an inward breath and an outward breath, the last raiments of a white, hot life. And she sang of the pipit's soft electric whistle and the inching, hoarse-whinnying trill of the little grebe. Her last words thus, a wet rhapsody of distorted breath, one holy dream of ash scattered on the river Annalee. And she told me her first kiss was in late autumn on a bed of wet grass and yellowing leaves by the hazel trees. It was evening and there was scarce traffic over Dromore Bridge. Just the breath of young lovers and the rich fluting in the black cat's crescendo. And she told me 9 trees hang over the river, dropping their fruit onto its black water. And every afternoon, old Mary clambers along the banks, filling her pockets with hazelnuts, her eye, her good eye fixed on the O'Reilly, he, the Diane who caught a salmon where no salmon swim. And she told me, I fished for pike, perch, roach, the eel, trout, bream, trench, minnow and rudd. But that wasn't on the Dromore, that too was on the Annalee, where once I caught a lamprey eel, the thorn kisser, and then spent the night with Mary, guzzling hazelnut and hawthorn berry stew. But Christ, My fear of being motherless couldn't stay my sleep, and I dreamt instead of supping that stew at the end of the world, of Billy-Rahel who guards the hazel tree, of new brides gifted catkins in a forest flush with birth. Then her chest burst with long twining branches, full of the livery of simple greens, embroidered with a wicked pulsing of red filbert fruit in crimson crown, and flowering aments in yellow hue. But by the Dromore River, she said, the air sharpening and heavy with moisture, having walked in rhythm, he gripped my waist, and I never realized how much the reach of his arm swallowed me, and how hungry that made me, and how hungry I was. And the common darkness cleaved fulsomely, anxiously, and it hung on my eyelids like heat, she said. And her breath was susurrating leaves, and she chanted of the past, an incantation to wallow in his skin, an incantation of plucked pores, effervescent cheeks and bucking, shivering to the touch, an incantation of hip pressed to hip, of the thirst-struck listening in the twilight, an incantation of nothing else but the having and the being had. And she told me, I have and I do, and I must have more, and I do, and I drink and I must, and still it is that I must drink, and I do. Then her chest burst with long twining branches, full in a livery of simple greens, embroidered with the wicked pulsing of red filbert fruit in a crimson crown, and flowering aments in a yellow hue. And to a drumbeat of breathless water she fell still, and 9 trees hung over the river, dropping their fruit onto its course. And every afternoon she clambers along its banks, filling her pockets with hazelnuts and poaching salmon where none swim. But that was not on the Dromore, that was on the Annalee, where she and I guzzled hazelnut and hawthorn berry stew. Ah, it was beautiful the day she died. But now the levee skirls with white noise and elan. For here in the dark light, where prohibition becomes license, here there is death, the one true vision of abundance. So with one heartbeat, one steady moment of exultant pleasure, in rapture, I become the sum of stars, the end anew to end. And so it is that we will break this mesh that binds us. We will break this mesh that binds us. We must and we will.
Amazing.
There you go.
That was some performance.
Told you they're long.
Let's have
Hopefully it was
another.
really enjoyable.
Wow, but just it's fascinating. Just being, you know, letting you in one room and us in another room. I've seen you perform, Oisín, but we've been in the same small spaces. This is something different, actually. It's really fascinating. And of course, you're performing this work more and more, aren't you? Well, when you can.
Well, this one is actually, that's only the second time I've ever performed that one.
Is it really?
Yeah. Yeah, I was really keen for Donald to actually hear me perform it because. You know,
so Donald is here, isn't he? Yeah.
So yeah, I was really keen to hear him, see words together in meaning cohesion. But yeah, no, that's only the second time I've ever done that one. So yeah, it's a fun one. And while reading it, I remembered the last time I introduced it completely differently. Well, I have the same beginning of it, but then I entirely remembered, which I forgot this time to explain how the entire thing is actually extremely smutty.
I think we probably got that.
Yeah.
So Donald, how did you? So you've been part of a
me,
muse for this, haven't you?
Because it's really interesting because I've read that poem many times, and I think that performance of it's interesting. Every time it just brings up new emotions for me, obviously, because it was a very intense day in my life. That it was probably one of the most beautiful, profound moments in my life in terms of like I think Oisín captured perfectly. The entire day was almost euphoric because my mum had been sick for a very long time. She had Alzheimer's for 5 years, and she was the most, I suppose, she was almost she was just so full of life, and she was one of the most social human beings who ever existed. So the day was such a celebration of her life that it was such a privilege of me to honor that and to, I suppose, acknowledge the connectedness that she had left in her aftermath almost. But what really hit home when Oisín read the poem there was how I remember that moment vividly, because it never really hit me that the bond had been broken until, I'm not sure if any of you have been to cremation before, but what happens is the coffin is behind, sorry, it's the top of the room, and then there's a see-through curtain that passes one end, and then there's the actual curtain that passes the second time. And Oisín is, I suppose, the poem, the moment that he's references is the moment where the second curtain passed. And that's when the actual crushing impact of the grief hit me out of, like, it was like a punch to the face. It was, I've never ever experienced anything like it in my life. But I think what I love about the poem in its entirety is the ability within which, I suppose, it almost bookends life with the euphoria of sexuality and connectedness and joy with the actual degradation of that, and the consequence of almost, you know, being in that system, being in that network, and you know, how do you make sense of all of that, knowing that will disappear in the end. You know, all those connections will disappear, no matter what, you know, legacy you leave or what kind of footprint that you have in this world. It'll eventually disappear because you put anything in a long enough timeline. So I love the poem, but it was definitely, it gave, there was new life and new nuance and beauty to it that I didn't perceive until he just performed it there.
Wow, well have you, Donald? I think you said everything. Yeah, about the emotion of the poem, definitely. And exactly, he's dead right. That is exactly what I was trying. Well, I'm delighted that it came off, but that's exactly what I was trying to do. Exactly the moment I was referencing, exactly what I was, trying to do. I mean, the one thing, the other thing about the poem that I do really, I did do that I don't know if comes out on the actual page, not page, in the performance. I know it comes out on the page. I don't know if it comes out in the performance. Is so there's a weaving in of like the whole love story of Oisín, the Gaelic myth, into it, and all the like adjacent characters. They're all woven into it as well to provide a different perspective. But I do make one major change to that myth, which is a little Ngubai who is the jealous brother. I decided that because he basically just gets to be the jealous brother throughout the entire thing and has no real involvement other than being jealous and tragic. I decided to give him a tragic superpower, which is the ability to separate himself into tiny little shards of himself to observe different perspective points through time. So he watches over the entire poem. The other thing I did is it's deliberately written so that there can be any one, the narrator is variable. It can be narrated by the mother figure. It can be narrated by the guy with the shards. It can be narrated by the poet, or it can be also narrated by the quasi-witch that's referenced at the very end as kind of like the harbinger with the hazel tree and all of that. So it's, the poem reads just as well whichever one you think is the narrator, and they're all meant to be whichever one you like.
In true postmodern style.
Yeah.
Yeah, the style of it actually reminds me quite quickly of my old friend McDara Woods. I don't know if you read him at all.
No, not at all. I'm now writing it down.
He's a Dublin poet. He died last year or the year before. He was probably by the Gallery Press, and his early work was extremely rich amalgam of myth and personal experience, which was extremely unfashionable at the time, actually, and
Still is.
Yeah, I was just really excited by the style because there was nobody else doing anything like that. Certainly not in Britain. I mean, it just passed completely out of. But he keeps looking back more to poets of the 40s, I think, to early W.S. Graham and that whole tradition that goes back to Yeats and you know, that balance between mythology and personal experience, which is very hard to establish. I mean, it's a very ambitious poem. I must say, I must congratulate you for the ambition in it, and the theatrical effect is amazing. Actually, I mean, that's another reason that it reminded me of McDara, because he was a fantastic performer of his own work. You know. So yeah, thanks very much for that, Oisín.
Very much my immense pleasure. And I'm both extremely flattered, and I absolutely agree. Because not agree with the praise, obviously, because that's flattering. I mean, I agree with the criticism. What was I going to say there, though? Just on the weaving of myth. Yeah, no, it's just something I personally I love poetry that wants to make I suppose a challenge, a statement, or try and create a view and an image and a concept. And I remember when I did a creative writing thing when I was in my undergrad, and I loved the professor was fantastic. Some of you will know him, Alan Gillis. I thought he was great fun. Really, really lovely guy. Liked his work, liked his poetry, all that. But we used to have these wonderful arguments where he would try and get me to write something about a bottle of Lucozade, and I would tell him that there's nothing profound about a bottle of Lucozade, and we'd have these arguments where, yeah, kitchen sink versus whatever the hell I do. It's great fun.
Oisín, can I ask a question? How long did it take you to write that?
Jesus, I have no idea. The weird thing is, like, no, not really. I normally, the way I write these things is like, it's kind of, I probably start in a kind of collage method. So like I write little snippets of things, and then every so often I kind of stare at them and see if they fit together in any kind of way. And then when I start seeing a pattern in that, then I just sort of go, oh, that's the pattern. And then I don't really do anything. And then a little while later, I'll feel I know what it's trying to do. And then once I know what it's trying to do, then I'll just sit and write the damn thing. So, I mean, the actual draft of what you heard, the whole thing from start to finish, began on South William Street in a cafe at 8 a.m. And when I was over last Christmas, and it finished in No Name Bar on Fade Street at 9:30 p.m. while I was surrounded by people, where I just about ate. I think that's all I did. And then that night ended with me at 5 a.m. in that bar on Duke Street, the wine bar. My brain is forgetting the name of it. It's small. It's a French wine bar. I probably spent about 3 to 4 hours on about 12 to 13 separate occasions, just editing it. So I suppose cumulatively, it probably took about 2.5 weeks of solid work. But like, you know, of 7-hour slots, if we worked it out that way. So yeah, I don't know what that is. Like 80 hours, 90 hours, something like that.
You wouldn't ever complete a piece of work like that in hours. You would is that fair to say? Well, I could imagine that you would walk it in your head for quite a long time.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, absolutely.
So in that sense, it's months and months.
Yeah. No, I mean, it comes and then it just sort of wanders around with you until it decides to be done.
Yeah, and your work strikes me as more composed than written. Yeah. Which definitely makes it very Irish.
No, it's very much deliberately written musically with an attempt at a kind of a symphonic structure. It's full of refrains, imagistic or literal refrains. It really is designed to be layered upon.
So you probably could do with a wee rest, and we might hand over to Jerry for a few minutes if you like.
That sounds perfect. Thanks so much, everyone.
Thank you. For Mila Maigat.
Yeah, well, I could read a poem myself.
Yeah, that'd be lovely.
Yeah, this is one that this is about. There's another one about traveling to Ireland. In fact, I spent 5 years altogether in Ireland. I went back and forward quite frequently, and this is on one level a kind of anecdote about landing in Holyhead. And during the 70s, you were under surveillance quite regularly by by the special branch and interrogated quite briskly. And it was quite an unnerving experience the first time it happened to me. So I wrote this poem about one of these incidents. It's called Prevention of Terrorism. When the special branch at Holyhead picked me out from the queue off the boat to grill me aside in the customs shed, I wasn't quite sure if it rankled or not. They all had cockney tongues in their heads and tall, pale faces like cliffs of chalk, and their Doberman looked underfed as it sniffed my flies for bombs and pot. They called me sir, but their eyes were lead, and their fingers gave away their thoughts as they stirred my bag and frisked my legs and arms for arms. Was I really a Scot, as my passport said, in black and red? Was that an authentic glottal stop, or a blind for one of the 40 shades of homicidal guilt? I guessed what caught their eye was just the Fenian red of my hair and beard. I couldn't think what else could single me out from the herd. I was cursed by tinkers, a gift to cops, but otherwise I was hard to peg. Who could I be? Why hadn't I bought a return like a tourist? Did I earn my bread in the land of stout and bog and sod? Was I going just where my ticket said? The questions probed like cattle prods, but much the same had churned in my head all night on the crossing, and what came out were the same half-truths that had paced the deck as they drew the sum of my earthly goods from my pockets and shoulder bags and spread the lot on the table. The unwashed socks, the shirts bunched up like an unmade bed, the threadbare sables in the watercolour box, the dog-eared spiral pad, excuse me, the dog-eared spiral pad and my dad's old harmonica missing 2 notes. They acted like a bomb disposal squad, as if each item might explode. I looked at it all as if I were dead, and my life exploded. By the time I caught the Glasgow train, my nerves were shreds. I was feeling flensed and finely chopped, but strangely light, like a lung x-rayed. If I was in the clear, the only blots were the poems they'd put aside, unread. That was a difficult poem to write. Technically, Oisín, you might have noticed there were only 2 rhymes in it. I set myself a bit of a challenge there.
Oh, sorry, I'm getting a message from Donald who wants to get back in. Can you let him in to the chat? Sorry. Yeah, no, I did very much so. I really liked the. I don't know how to describe it. There's something nice and muddy about the way the last letter of each word almost falls into the next one when you're reading it. Yeah, there's kind of earthy muddiness to it that really resonates in my head. Does that make any sense?
Yeah, but it could do. not to me, but it might. It might. Yeah. No, it was a challenge. I don't think the poem needed, actually. I think if the effect is right, that's good enough.
Mm-hmm.
Will I read another extract from this the book? Hello? I can't hear anybody.
She's on mute.
Sorry, I was just making sure Donald was sorted there. Yeah, no, we'd love you to carry on, I think. Do I speak for everyone?
Well, this is a later episode where I meet through the various literary connections in McDade's, a fellow who was to be quite a close friend for many years in the future, called Eddie Linden, who was the editor of Aquarius. This is actually an extract from The Dark Horse, that's published in The Dark Horse, the latest issue. Well, I was reading that poem from that as well, in case you're interested to reread it. You could put up that drawing of Eddie Linden, actually, which goes along with it. It's actually on the page that I'm reading from. "I'm Eddie Linden," said the small man who approached me at the bar counter of Keogh's, shaking my hand. "I'm frae Bells Hill in Lanarkshire, but I'm really half Irish. I'm a Catholic atheist. I hear you're from Glasgow." He was a slight and round-backed figure, possibly pushing 40, with a frightened tangle of thin, fair hair. His clean-shaven face looked simultaneously boyish and woefully bashed about, with a dented nose and crooked bottom teeth, like that of a timorous child who has just escaped from a gang of bullies. His manner suggested that he was still being pursued by persecutors of some sort, but he leaned forward boldly, like an exclamation mark in italics. He spoke with an air of headlong urgency, and his resonant voice proclaimed his Scottish working-class origins with no margin for error. He had approached me with a look of anxious curiosity through the smoky hubbub of the bar-room in the company of an Irish writer who had promised to introduce us, and he had launched into his speech before our mutual acquaintance had retreated into the crowd. I was standing with my back against one of the mahogany partitions, pint glass in hand, trying not to look as if I were recoiling from his forthright posture. His translucent blue eyes, in a halo of pale eyelashes and eyebrows, conveyed an almost aggressive appeal for sympathy. "I hear you write poetry," he was saying. "I write poetry too. I run a magazine in London. Have you heard of Aquarius? I've done 3 issues. You'll need to send me some of your poems. I've had George Barker in it and John Heath Stubbs. Do you know his poetry? What brings you to Dublin? I'm Irish myself, you know. I was born in Coal Island, but I grew up in Scotland. I was illegitimate. I was brought up Catholic, but I discovered communism. It's hard being homosexual when you're Catholic." I'd received a modicum of forewarning about Eddie in advance of this meeting, which had been arranged by the poet Brian Lynch after I'd bumped into him in Grafton Street the day before. "There's a competitor of yours in town just now," he'd said. "Runs a poetry magazine and he's looking for contributions. Absolute madman, some kind of manic depressive, flies off the handle when he's had a drop too many, but he's harmless enough. You'll have to meet him. I was telling them all about you. If you'll be in Keogh's tomorrow night, I'll tell someone to point him out to you." I'd been prepared to encounter a certain amount of unconventional discourse from this character, but I was nevertheless disconcerted by the fervid egocentricity he displayed in his very first remarks, which employed the word "I" 4 times before I'd had a chance to open my mouth. I suppose that he was fishing for information about me, but I soon realised that conversation with Eddie meant forcing one's way into his own monologue, however briefly, as soon as there was any hint of an opening. It felt a bit like dashing through a torrential waterfall with a defective umbrella. "I went to a Catholic school," I managed to say, "but they expelled me for blasphemy." "Is that right? That's amazing. Good for you. I joined the Communist Party when I was 16. My stepfather was a coal miner. I founded Catholic CND in London. I've been living in London for 13 years. Do you know Maida Vale? I used to work on the railways in Scotland." "So did I. I used to unload mail trains." "Is that right? That's a coincidence. I was a porter at Hamilton West. An awfully hard job sometimes. You had to get up or work in the middle of the bloody night. That's how I got to London in the first place. I had a job already. I just had to find digs. Do you know Tom Leonard in Glasgow? You'll have to meet him. He's very good to me when he's sober." I'd met many magazine editors, but Eddie seemed to be the polar opposite of anyone's conception of such a role, which conjures up an image of a purposeful and judicious individual. He seemed to be barely literate by his own account of his dysfunctional background, and I was later taken aback by the random mixture of upper and lower cases in his handwriting when I first saw it. He had no literary theories or editorial objectives to declare, and he spoke more like a helpless psychiatric patient in need of a listener. He leapt like a flea from subject to subject, and it would take me years to identify the network of invisible connections that often linked one sentence to another. I was beginning to learn that the movement of his thought was actually circular, like a dog firmly tethered to a stake, where the stake was his own wounded ego. I couldn't stay with him for long that evening, but we arranged to meet for coffee the next day in Bewley's Oriental Cafe, where he resumed the recital of his oral autobiography. We prolonged the conversation in a tortuous pub crawl that zigzagged across the Liffey from the Palace Bar to Mulligan's and Poolbeg Street, deliberately avoiding McDade's as a potential quagmire. And there's too many folk to get my back up in there. There's too many the tiny wee talents with big mouths. In the Espresso Cafe in South Ann Street, where we paused to swallow some scrambled egg rolls and tea, he came very close to provoking physical violence in a talkative group of youths at the next table who were loudly expressing their sympathy for the provisional IRA. After a brief exchange of remarks, Eddie stood up and launched into a recitation of a poem of his own called City of Razors, a sketch of the vicious sectarian violence that had helped to drive him away from Glasgow. Walls scrawled with "fuck the Pope" and blue-lettered words, "God bless the Rangers." Eddie's in the Royal with a sword in his stomach, and the Razors are floating in the River Clyde. I thought I already had a clear idea of the essential Eddie until I witnessed this performance. He was reciting from memory with his eyes closed as if in prayer or a trance. The pitch of his voice had risen to a tone very like a priestly incantation during Mass as he strode up and down the narrow aisle between the tables, waving his fist. I was fascinated by the shamanistic quality of his delivery, which suggested a being possessed by some higher spirit, and I wasn't to see its like again until I first heard native Gaelic speakers reciting their verse in pubs on the west coast of Ireland. Hamish Henderson later persuaded me to see Eddie's bearing as a relic of an ancient folk bardic tradition to which the almost talentless William McGonagall also belonged. But the audience in the Espresso Cafe was less impressed. They stared and giggled at first, exchanging glances that expressed their doubts about Eddie's sanity, but their faces froze when he brought the point home to the present, informing them that the bomb-planting provos were nothing but a gang of murderous bastards. The oldest-looking member of the group beckoned me to one side and muttered in an incongruously calm tone of voice, "I'd advise you to take your friend back to Scotland if you don't want to see him getting kneecapped." I was already on my feet, and I set about dragging Eddie back into the street by his collar, not for the last time in my life.
Wow.
That's great.
Eddie is still going strong, actually.
I was just going to ask you about him. And I didn't know quite how much of a character he was until I listened to this, though.
Right. Well, you can read the rest of it in The Dark Horse.
Did you write it quite recently?
I did, yes. It wasn't that long ago. It was. It must have been. Yeah, it was after I came out of hospital, which was quite a watershed. I can date things from that. So yeah, it's. I've written most of the book right up to the end, but there's still a few gaps in it, and that was one of the gaps that I knew I was going to film. So it was it was good to get that done.
And of course, it's not only about Dublin.
No, it's it goes back to Glasgow. Almost immediately, because one of the questions that confronts anybody in exile really is why you left in the first place, and what it was you're leaving behind, and if you have any kind of Irish blood in you, in Ireland, that becomes an issue right away, because you've got to work out how much of that is you. And I didn't really come from a very strong Irish background, but it ran in the family, and I'd come from a background where that was very ecumenical. In fact, I was lucky to grow up in the part of Glasgow that was one of the most non-sectarian. Govan Hill was a very welcoming place. Still is, I think. That's why it's become such a home for immigrants, I think. But it's the question that I go into right away is that why had I come to Dublin in the first place, and what did it mean to me from the beginning? And those are all interesting questions.
Can I ask, and by the way, I really liked it, the sense of place was, there was wonderful comic timing. And there was a line about an umbrella that was fairly like normal, but for some reason I really, really liked it. And I thought it would be an amazing thing for a title for a book. But what I wanted to ask is just because what's your process for writing it? Do you just sit down and scribble, or do you plan, or how does this come to fruition?
Well, the prose has been a different thing from writing the poems, but it's been it's been a process of very long drafts, which I've edited and re-edited, and then added to as well as I remember bits and pieces. It's you start from a very I start from a very precise memory, a precise image, which in this case, it's a period, a juncture in my life that has had all sorts of resonances before and since, and which I've been wanting to get around to define in one way or another for a long time. So a lot of it was kind of brewing in my head anyway, and nothing very much had to be invented. But I did have the benefit of acacial letters, which I'd written at the time to my first wife, and they filled in all sorts of details which I would have forgotten very soon afterwards. But they help to stimulate the whole memory of the atmosphere of the time, and most of the details that I incorporated eventually got left out because it didn't mean that much to the reader. They just help to create the atmosphere. But it's been quite a long process because it's not something that's been making a living from. I mean, I've been doing it between other things, between reviewing and illustrating and all the rest of it, and one thing and another. I mean, the magazine that originally published the first chapters was enormously encouraging, really. I mean, the editors of Parnassus gave me a lot of encouragement and stimulation too, because they kind of criticised it and edited it as we went along, which was good for me. But also slowed me down a bit because once you're dealing with editors like that, you start editing yourself in the most minute ways that don't help the flow. But they're great for the end result, I think.
I agree with you on editors.
Yeah, it's amazing actually when you have a kind of confidence about your writing. Yeah, I've been writing for nearly 50 years, and I started publishing in my teens, and you think you know what you're doing all the time, really, but it takes a good reader to tell you that you don't necessarily know what you're doing, and it's not always as clear to the reader as you think it must be, and it's only when you look back at it and say, "Oh yeah, of course it could be taken that way." I'll have to fiddle about with that till it becomes clearer, so that the reader doesn't have to think about it at all. I think that's one of the important criteria. The writer's done all the work already, and you don't have to fuss and puzzle over it.
Gerard, I was going to ask a question. Did you write much or reflect much on your impressions of travelling through Northern Ireland, travelling from Glasgow down to Dublin?
I did, yeah. In fact, I was going to read that passage about Belfast. Do you know Belfast?
Yeah, I grew up in Portadown, where the Orange
Oh,
Order
right.
was founded, but now my family are in Belfast. So if I'd love to hear it if other people are.
Yeah, sure. I mean,
Deirdre.
I just wasn't kind of in the mood for it, but it's just a short. It's just a couple of pages.
And the reason I asked that, Gerald, is because you were obviously there in the early days of the Troubles, and when there would have been trouble both north and south of the border in Ireland. So I just think it'd be really interesting to hear your impressions and how it felt to you.
Yeah, I travelled overnight. You see, from I was really doing an economic traveller approach, because I actually slept outdoors at Stranraer in order to save money on a B&B. Wow. And by the time I got to Belfast, I was exhausted because I'd slept very badly. So this is what happens. In Belfast, I was unnerved by a nightmarish sensation of landing on an embattled foreign continent. A wet Sunday in Belfast had never been synonymous with joie de vivre, even at the best of times. And Ulster was now becoming the worst advertisement for Christianity since the Spanish Inquisition. The whole province had been convulsed by the outrage provoked by the new policy of internment, which the Heath government had introduced a few weeks previously. And the atmosphere had the menacing tension of an electric fence. The actual danger was probably exaggerated by the television images in my mind's eye of bomb-shattered buildings and burnt-out cars, but I saw nothing to soothe my anxieties. Hard-faced squaddies manned the ticket barrier in full battle kit, holding their machine guns disturbingly close to the trigger, and a row of field green armoured cars faced the station exit as if the army had been warned to expect an invasion from Scotland by train. A contingency laden with irony in view of the soldiers' unmistakable Scottish accents. A smear of rain had dulled the station's brick facade, and the stacked sandbags made me think of damp grey boulders exposed by a receding tide. The streets seemed to have been deserted by their usual inhabitants in favour of the occupying forces. I was disappointed to learn that I had 2 hours to wait for a connection to Dublin, and I resolved to pass the time as discreetly as possible, rather than obey my usual urge to explore. I found a nondescript wee snack bar across from the station and spent more than an hour hunched over a couple of local newspapers, consuming a plateful of bacon rolls and 2 pots of tea. In Ballymurphy that week, the army had shot 11 civilians dead, including a mother of 8 children and a priest who was administering the last rites to a wounded man. In Belfast the day before, a Catholic toddler had been pushing a pram along the pavement with her sister when gunfire broke out and she was killed by a ricochet. IRA bombs had just damaged the Derry office of the Belfast Telegraph and wrecked the headquarters of the Ulster Unionist Party a few blocks away from me. I had never been so close to a violence so public, and the effect was more than a little disturbing. I had the feeling of sitting inside the calm eye of a storm, waiting for the blast that might turn the window to flying smithereens at any moment. I suddenly understood why I'd found a vacant table next to the window, which would already have been occupied anywhere else. Infantry patrols tramped past at regular intervals in gleaming wet helmets and incongruous khaki camouflage, and I was close enough to the pavement to hear the clack of the tackety boots from a long way off. Every time a Saracen armoured car rumbled down the street, the cups and cutlery tinkled nervously. There were less than a dozen other customers in the cafe, mostly sitting alone like myself. And the only constant sources of conversation were the middle-aged waitress and an elderly female cashier who murmured in undertones as if the lunch orders were a highly confidential matter, unfit for the ears of casual eavesdroppers. I was carefully avoiding the eyes of my fellow lunchers, and they appeared to be avoiding mine. But my glance kept straying towards a thin-faced, 40-ish woman who'd come in from the rain shortly after me, bareheaded and empty-handed. She was sitting alone in a dim corner facing the wall, but I could make out the pale contours of her profile as she slumped over the Formica tabletop, with her hands clasped in her lap, staring at her teacup in a state that looked almost catatonic. She must have sat in that position for half an hour without moving a muscle, watching her tea grow cold. I stared at her for long moments at a time until I caught the eye of someone watching me. Her strange posture had already become the focus of an unspoken, half-embarrassed attention in the room, and I wasn't at all surprised when her shoulders began to heave. Tears were dribbling down her cheeks, which she made no attempt to check. Her half-stifled sobbing was suddenly the only sound we could hear. It seemed to create a strange sense of relief among the customers, who were now exchanging shy glances and shrugs of compassion. No one moved at first, and I was ready to get up and offer her a hanky, when the waitress bustled over and handed her a bundle of paper napkins. She stood over her for a few minutes, talking inaudibly with a hand on her shoulder, then returned to lean on the counter, shaking her head resignedly as she whispered to the cashier and busied herself with plates. The woman was still weeping inconsolably when I left.
That's heartbreaking.
Yeah, it's an image I never forgot.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
But it's one of my very few experiences of Belfast. It may be.
Sorry, you're asking me?
No, I'm saying it was one of my very few experiences of
Yeah,
Belfast
yeah.
because I never went back through Belfast.
Oh, right, okay.
Yeah. When I was going back to Scotland, I would go over to Holyhead and Liverpool and Heysham and so forth.
More civilized?
In order to avoid Belfast, you know.
Yeah.
I think so many people in the Republic have that feeling as well, or just that it was just so disconnected from it in the South.
Yes, I know.
It was funny because I studied at UCD, and it was partly a conscious decision to go to Dublin to avoid what was happening in Northern Ireland. And I'm very glad I did. So that's where I got to know some of the pubs you're talking about.
Yeah.
And it was such an escape, you know.
Yeah, the very first, I think everyone from the South remembers, when you first went to the border and you saw all the checkpoints and the machine gun. I've only ever seen that one other place in my life, and that was when I was crossing the border from Turkey into Syria. It was very odd. Eh?
Mm. Yeah, I'm glad you like that passage. It's the first time I've ever read it.
Oh, it's great.
Oh, it's fantastic.
It's incredible.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's really
the little detail about the acknowledgement of why that table was empty as well. I think I've only been to Belfast once, and there was a few moments like that as well where you're just trying to understand why things are so. It's a beautiful detail.
All right, thanks. Yeah, it's an eye opener. The whole, the couple of hours that I spent in it, it was just unforgettable.
I'm going to say something really banally stylistic. I really like your sentence structure. I think you have, how do I put it? You have an excellent control over sentence length in the terms of a kind of, how would I say, footstep-like rhythm to the way your words connect together. I mean, most of your sentences are one clause, singular action plus a follow-up clause for detail, and pretty much always like that, with punctuated by very occasional short sentences and very occasional long sentences. But it gives it a really nice walking beat when you listen to it that is really appealing to the ear.
Oh, thank you very much. Yeah, it's very nice to hear a critique of something I suppose I do unconsciously.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, my prose style is something I've had to work on for a long time. Work as a journalist is good for that, because you don't waste any words. You work as a journalist too.
Yeah, financial journalist.
All right. Yeah. Yeah, I've been working for Times Literary Supplement for maybe 30 years. I don't know if I'll be doing it in the future, because it seems to have changed beyond recognition, but we'll see. When did you get that 72B?
I just followed whatever you had written.
Oh, I see. No,
He's
no,
sent me
no,
a
I think
Word
it was.
document with
I think it was just a code. There's a code to identify different copies of a drawing. You know.
Sure, yeah. So, well, that's just a new alternative name for it now.
Right. Does that still look the same now? I haven't been there for a long time.
Well, I think there's something quite iconic about the art that's coming from, you're just coming from the Halfpenny Bridge there, aren't you?
That's right. Yeah.
When you go into the street, there are always little shops opening and closing in those little cubbyhole shops,
Right.
corners there. They change quite frequently, don't they, Oisín? I think you've probably been there even more recently than I have.
That one on the left there, you can see a kind of triangular awning. Was actually a very good second-hand bookshop.
Oh,
and you can see a dresser. It looks like a kitchen dresser, just to the right of the woman.
yeah. Oh, yeah.
The bookseller used that to stack books up. So you were looking at books on this dresser. I think the building at the end of the street is long gone. I think that's a multi-story.
Yeah.
Multi-story monstrosity, the Bank of Ireland or something.
Yeah.
That's interesting.
Well, why don't we hear from Oisín again?
Yeah, I mean, I'd be delighted to do one last. I'd be really happy to do one last thing. The second thing I wanted to read is, how would I say? It's something I'm working on. It's not actually finished, so it is a little shorter, not massively shorter, but it is a little shorter, which is good. It also fits, I suppose, the kind of post-apocalyptic theme we started riffing on when we started talking about Belfast. So it's not remotely. I mean, the first 3 sections of a piece that I anticipate will be 7 sections. It will eventually be the longest thing I've ever written, not the shortest. But for now, it's somewhat shorter. So it's going to be a 7-part piece. And it's really inspired by just thinking about sensuality, but from a very different perspective to the last poem. It is about the movement of an ardent sensualist towards, and how an ardent sensualist may have a desire to find, I suppose, an almighty God, a unifying belief that gives comfort and safety in the kind of uncertainty that type of approach actually has. But that's as far as I've gotten in the poem. So it's, here's a sensualist, here's the moment of, abnegation, fear, doubt. Here's the moment of revelation, which is an attempt also at doing Terrence Malick time lapses, but in words. But it's going to then evolve after his revelation is his consistency, because a sensualist is actually consistent, and how that consistency eventually leads him to adhering to the most absolute creeds, and then becoming a suicide bomber, and then blowing himself up, and then lauding him for his consistency. Obviously, I personally don't agree with it, but I thought it would be an interesting thing to do, to write a narrative that explained why that kind of, what's the word, inculcation of views, isn't it? Radicalization, that's it. Why it happens and why it's coherent. And then try and find beauty in that without attaching a critique, even though I obviously do disagree with it. So that's what the whole piece is going to be about, but we haven't got as far as the radicalization yet, so the controversial parts haven't happened yet. So the poem is called The Kerygma, which is a word I actually discovered when I was researching the idea, revelatory interpretation and investigation of dogma and truth. Okay. It is in the black, where shallow folds twine skin and the thrumming of stars stakes the speech and patterns of knowing, that slow touch turns at once to fast, and you twist in front of me, hungry in the summer air. And the offcuts of stray water-hungry plants lose fear in the gummed-up works of a body set for pleasure, so that we might list instead to the humbling din of that wanting that preceded us. I must have, as antecedent to time, as wet-tongued disavowal, it simultaneous with a vision of grappling, a vision of kneading the hard lines of your skin. A must that is in the black thrumming, as thirst slams the cusp of my spine and rises now that we are thrall to the shanking vicissitudes of burning ash. A must that yields the kindling for my deathbed, here tears, and yet here tears up the root of me and of you, and forces my return to that kerygma of that other place, where blood runs cold on black soil, there at the ruins near Tara. It is in the black, where unspent laughter heals and harms in equal measure, and you and I at terrain, where our bodies thrash briefly in a pool of lint and ash and muck, but we pause to avoid glutting ourselves with a sacrament, the unction of the sick, for we were not prepared to be anointed with the lifting of sin. Then through sin, in a wholeness that binds, rise to each other again, but this time with one to feast as the other starves, in a wallowing of bleached pleasure, cleft by betrayal, a snapped key in a decade-old lock, eschewing its inverse in the static moaning leather on cobbled stone, heavy such admission. And it is through this holy anointing, may the Lord in his love and mercy help you with the grace of the Holy Spirit. Amen. May the Lord who frees you from sin save you and raise you up. Amen. May the Lord who frees you from sin save you and raise you up. It is with muck I anoint myself, an irreducible finality. Amen. And with seed and stamen previously gorged on deep breaths of water, the sacrament of need breeds a cholera not in the impulse of having, where dark lesions beneath the bark rise to the crown, and you are forced to become that which you do not wish to be, to have that which you must have, a child, doubly, and the forest floor lays covered, spread with the sinews of your stretched heart, ushering the same state unto another again, a canker, like a diamond, grey wood, creeping along the bark, a dryness in the knowledge that you are not what once you were. Amen. And you, who grew up under the sun-splitting shadows of Barb Sharkey, how is it that you must rent life with that oriental disease, particularly harmful to the young, where in the late summer small fruits illustrate the clotting of veins with apologies of love, Chalazé now wrought from abnegation, and you, who stood by the tongue tower, the ziggurat in the temple of the god Nabu, disciple of Beers Nimrod, whose lesser edifice is a soft hankering for a speech we cannot share, how is it that you, who walked each year to the holy city of our birth, you who inscribed the fates and thus knew why our fathers roiled with love for hard wood and pellets of iron slung, then lodged in great houses, encoded by the ghost of messages of ardor and time-spent sundries, a land the vituperative, the heavenly and the banal, how is it that you have forgotten how to teach us why we must abandon our guilt in the sun-drenched splitting of ourselves, it that becomes us one to another? Yet there, at Beers Nimrod, much like my own ancestors cut stone from the earth to build the first city and yet the fifth, it is you, the disciples of Nabu, who know that on the 11th day the fates of the land were settled, and your madness is inscribed on the tablets. And now your sins define you, not through action but in grief. The clay bakes, wordless in the sun, and your grief binds us threshing in the black. 2. You must know, however, that I forswore of again partaking in the gabble, of permitting myself to be stirred by the dousing rain of polymers and stamped feet on age-old pedals. I forswore, feeling my soul lifted by the innocent raggery of young boys sounding music of the old grey and grey stone temples until all that remains is their hair raised on my skin, and I transported, resplendent and close to God, thanks to their gift. Theirs a gift that touches even flint with pain, and thereby reminds us how we endure, and more than that, reminds us how we are exalted. I forswore, murmuring incantations many, my hands dried on flecks of rubbed sand, as each time I lean to the earth and submit, through submission find peace. I forswore, holding but one thought, thoughtlessness, and heeding but one vision, abnegation, and through it an end to the ceaseless lament, and a beginning of wisdom, laughter at the end of a rope, and the end of it last in the top of a mountain, with each outcome being just the same, for I return, and I return, and I return. I forswore the pious clattering of gathered jades and rose quartz, topaz quartz, lapis lazuli, smoky quartz, emerald, red jasper, orange carnelian, the garnet stone, so that I might purify myself, restoring trust, joyously forgiving and heal myself till my bones shake with restored intentions, anxiety banished, pain banished, then loved myself unconditionally and in balance so that I might find the soil again, sundering my spirit with creativity, filling me with desire and want and need, and bathing me in living fire. And I held back praise for the mother of liberation, whose face is red and who told us once of her fears, and also holds the heart that showered. I was lipless numb even for the 142 who dwell there with the holy at the entrance. Even though there is cathesis, it's a living breath of words, a rite of words. Even though it's the sanctuary of space by Dubh Nagal, where the hallowed lay buried. Even though when once there I, under the watchful eye of the readers of the Sinhas Mar, drank ale to observe the band fesh and hold consort in my hands. Mev, whose dirge still stirs my bones today. Mahmoba Korb Kalis flew, one brief divine intervention. Her gift to us concealing fame, he who daubs paint and redness with swift incision, who holds up the capstone of his grave, always to speak, oh, for it's a pity, who battled in Limerick the Cleo Mal, and he never spurned the raising of a hand to stay another, and he tore his rivals down when they were strongest, yet he took the principal land today, not by his hand, but through his wit. But his power, like an unsteady load, needs must, it crushed him. Yet for all that I have forsworn, for all that I have said and meant, my only cathexis remains the milk white of trailing legs. Her thin tendrils, barely fit to hold her up, shook under the weight of her given, cleaved and open, decorated by the inky hand of other women. They show the feasting of skulls on flesh, death on life, and life on the sin of the ceaseless wanting that right now is the pads of my fingers like gristle upon her calves, but is also that craving that grows the more we fill ourselves. And I grip her sharp rent frame. I wrap one arm around her, the other presses down on her chest to keep her fixed to the floor. And this is power, but also limitation, because she keeps me fixed, not with motion, but with wild sight, a blinding profundity that insists she's the, so we must. But then again, there was another, she a harlequinade of footsteps on sandflecked stone, a silhouette of of pinioned shadows, a darkness rent from black linen and sun-served skin, sight, the only hint of life, she having only, well, once sundered without choice, one foot after the other, and every third drives the wind to briefly outline her slenderness. And it speaks to the heart of you. You wanted to snap her, she who was hard, but also brittle like a twig. And then there was I, there was the day when I, wholly in an unshakable depth of feeling, and poor too, so poor I gather pennies by the bagful to pay for groceries at a 24-hour Tesco. But eager and desperate for love, I sat with her and we had planned to leave. But she was slowly torn at by the bacon pains. And they came up in her and at her and through her, and she had to soothe herself. But even though we had just called an end to everything, when I saw her hand move up her sallow mole-addled legs, the top of the Venetian lace she'd said was not for anyone but herself. It had to be for me. Thank Christ, though it was not, it was. And the eyeful of each other's lips we shared was enough, and soon fabric tore at her ankles, and the white hotness brought to mind another day when she wore soft Spanish linen, but only front and back, and we mauled each other on the lightning-struck Adriatic coast. But yet for all that I have forsworn, that holy gablin over root and seed and sheaf, for all that I have said and meant, that my only cathexis would from now on be the milk white of trailing legs, I know what it is to feel an absence of the heart, one that the depths of laughter cannot fill, and I know it is a relentless need that will not abate, and I know I must, in the face of its storm, I know I must relent. I relent, dear Lord, I relent, yet much as I cannot forswear your love, I cannot avoid your censure. The glutting of my soul is as unavoidable as the saturation of my senses with skin brushed to skin. Thus, if you censure me, let it be in hot poison. Let me be what I must be, the most human of your instruments and the most divine. Child of Beers Nimrod and the wetness of the western cliffs, a disciple in the heart of Chower. I beg you then, in relenting, let our joining be an unyielding thing, an annihilation rendered unto reed, loose upon the lake. 3. Here then, at once the force and instrument, the tiller and the hand. It is watchfulness, that most promiscuous of parsings, that shows the birth of novae in the uncharted. There, rising, they move through a vowel, and this results a cusp in that which swallows all it was. But this is an instant that is always, was always, will always be. A fractional timber, euphony, eudaimonia, the epiphanic, an arresting choral jolt, and the stillness you once eschewed that strips bark to feed, gives life to those whirling dervishes derived of loving, and returns the stars themselves to singularities. And it is this instrument, that agent of signification, limited only by consistency, that forms that which was, must be, and is, and is, and is, and is. And so it is we see time at extremes of talk, as it splutters hot and cold, and shivers blended residues of vapor, disturbed in complex beats by the din of beating wings, their tense frames toiling through the still liquids, that feast for birds. And it ends here in autumn, so it is that we see light refracted through this matrix of fractured stops of clocks, that brazen rumination of spent hours, years in hoc to antecedents. It tills in distinct measures, a tilt from north to south, and again in centripetal spin. It is that harvested intensity spilled out also into the wholeness of silence. In its breach, it cleaves life and death apart, so that its differing attentions fill gaps in our parentheses. And these waves of light through time trigger mind in the heart, and rooted there abide the twin apotheosis, the requiem in him, shivers in the meristem, and sliced its moon-shaped leaves cling to the dome, an issuance of thorns and spines, tendrils, and starlight gripping greens. It is thus that form is integral to ash, and just like its prerequisite states, that form yields a cellular tabernacle of growing pains, one of halted spears diverted from a fettering of wood. But had time not played its part to force an inward turn, needs must that hearth would thrust upwards that twisting hull of slow life, in a groaning wave of age spurred, grasping for forest fruit. But where time and light prompt shortness and the frost, that hallowed dome begins to hew, snipping at its edges, forcing a falling. Then survival is all that there is. It prompts a hardening of whorled brown roundness, pierced tits, and the soft grain of the load-bearing lung. And survival leaves us clinging to scales of insulated bark, desperate to protect the possibility of repeated origin. And so it is that we end here in autumn, that instant where youth gives way to death and birthing begins in the base of your bones. Yet there, split gusts sound their transit, a prelude to an annual libretto of frost. There, in a last jeweled aerial syncopation of brightly thrashing yellows and reds and greens, the forerunner of crunching spines and glistening veins, commingled as a future feast for spores, a vast nexus of alveoli, sacs of spent breath, gobbled as each may be the last, their canopic raiments giving lease to tunnels of light, as a crowned shyness forms one part of a polarization between kin and foe. Here, with Xenos' enemy and guest, and the parasite of scavenger, Streptostera, from a base echo of the last breath of youth, dying inside the body to give life to the body, a seed of faith in the death of history, holy birth, holy breath, holy it is. And the shyness saves kin from false entanglement, that ferocious reaching for its opposite, a smothering shading of the unrelated conspecific in tandem with light and time and pressure and restraint, ends as it must the prelapsarian. So it is, so it is, so it is, that led by an instant derived from the changes in an amber-coated form, that the slow-beating heart of that singular shape that breaks spring open in pink and white blossoms, yellows and hard-worn greens, that the first of those pink-dappled tongues, now in brilliant gold, red, orange, crisp-edged, but tired and bending, repents so that it may return to ash, and the last shall be the first. And this first act of repentance, it reveals a gnarled beauty and the grace of form through life, life as it is meant to be, and as it is written. And as this first tongue falls silent, in falling, in failing, it comes to no unity, a unity that starts in an asymmetric rotary, and then caught in hoarded breath, a seesawing drift until it comes to a final rest, bar one, upon the earth which will swallow it, so the ultimate resting place of a life well lived will fuel the burning pyre, restoring life to the spring. And I fall and come to know there is meaning and the absolute, and I'm in thrall, and evermore now that servant waiting on the edge for the call.
Ah. Yes. It seems to me as if it's more self-consciously dramatic than the other piece. In fact, it reminds me very forcibly of Shakespeare
Oh wow.
in the language and the rhetoric. I'm trying to think what character it is though.
Ah,
He sounds a bit like Hamlet at times.
that's not a bad shout. That's not a bad shout. I've never thought about that, but that's not a bad shout.
But in fact, you sound a wee bit like Jonathan Pryce doing Hamlet. But actually, the character is more like, I mean, the content of the thing is more like Mark Antony in Antony and Cleopatra.
Yeah. Wow.
There's a kind of sensual, kind of disturbed sensuality about it, that's obviously quite traumatic.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely what I'm going for.
So, I'm sorry, but Shakespeare's been there before you.
Yeah, I'm modernizing, flak jackets.
Yeah. Did you mention Tesco at one point?
Yes.
A 24-hour Tesco.
Yeah, I wondered if that was an oral illusion. Yeah, because it didn't seem to fit the context.
Yeah, I do that sometimes because even though the language is very highfalutin, it is still, I might not, be using the contemporary vernacular, but it is still rooted in a contemporary, I am describing a contemporary thing. So I do like to occasionally chuck in the odd very, very contemporary reference.
So I'm trying to get my pals Neil and Shauna to unmute themselves and join the party.
Yeah, sorry for missing the beginning of the event, but we've enjoyed all the recitations and readings. Really, really enjoying it.
Good.
Did somebody ask you about R.D. Laing? Is that why you mentioned him on your tract?
I heard you talking about him, and I just passed a little plaque in Govan Hill just the other day. So he must have, I don't know if he was born in Govan Hill or...
Yeah, apparently I just heard that very recently. I mean, I'm from Govan Hill myself.
Oh, right.
You mentioned Govan Hill, Gerald, did you?
Right, I must have, yeah.
I
grew up there till I was 12, but of course I was very interested to hear that Laing had come from there originally. Do you know where exactly?
I can't remember the name of the street, but it's not far from Coplaw Street. Coplaw Street.
Oh yeah. Is it a tenement? It's like a red sandstone tenement?
Yes,
Govan Hill has very rich literary background. Not to mention myself, of course, but
tell us more.
I discovered at Tom Leonard's at the funeral of Tom Leonard that he was actually born on Annette Street, which is next street to mine, which was Garturk Street.
Oh, I know Garturk Street because I go to Daisy Street and I pass over it.
I went to school in Daisy Street. That was my first primary school. Yeah.
Here.
Which is it's not. I don't think it's a school anymore. It's a social centre or something.
Yeah,
but,
that's right. I go with the babies, and it's got the Irish societies there.
Oh, I see.
In that centre,
All right.
Well, I've been told. I've not been in, but
it's a very nice building, actually. I mean, I remember it quite fondly, which is unusual, remembering your primary school, really. But the other connection is actually, do you know the Deer Green Place by Archie Hind?
Yes,
The novel. He came out in '66. I did a creative writing course with him. We shared the teaching in Midlothian once, and we got to talking and just discovered by accident. That we'd both lived for a long time in Govan Hill, and it turned out that he actually wrote that novel on Inglefield Street.
Oh, really?
Yeah, which is the same street as Garturk Street. It's just a continuation of it,
Mm-hmm.
So no, I had never imagined as I was, even long after I'd left Glasgow that it had so many associations.
Frightfully unintellectual and more kind of daring do. but John Buchan also lived in Govanhill
Did it really?
Okay.
on Queen Mary Avenue,
Oh,
which
he's
is
great fun.
kind of behind us. Sorry, Oisín?
He's great fun. No, I really, the 39 Steps is a really great yarn. It's a really, really well crafted, tight yarn.
Yeah,
Yeah.
Sean is originally from County Tyrone, but grew up from the age of 16 in Dumfries and Galloway. So we are often driving over the hills of Dumfries and Galloway, and I picture myself as, you know, a Nazi or something. It's not the Nazis. I picture myself as a First World War German agent chasing down some plummy first generation Scot. But sometimes, yeah. Yeah, so we know all those high, lonely roads over the top of Dumfries and Galloway quite well now. But yeah, that's. I'm sure there are loads of other.
Thanks so much for joining.
Oisín and Jerry was lovely. Really enjoyed it.
Thank you very much.
EY.
Thanks for
Thank
coming.
you so much for joining. Have a good night.
Right. Cheerio.
Deirdre, I'm going to have to go. Well, Jerry and everyone. But this has been lovely. Is this
It
the
has,
first?
isn't it?
This is the
What
first
an
session
evening.
of this group.
Sorry?
Is this the first session?
This is,
Is the
yeah,
intention
well,
to continue?
it's the first literary salon, really. And I think we can happily say it's succeeded, yeah.
Yes, it's been a great night.
Yeah, it's been very,
Yeah, it's been very-
enjoyable.
Very good for me.
And Sean, who was with us at the beginning, he suggested that we should do something for Scottish Book Week or Book Week Scotland. And I was getting emails to my personal email asking me what we were doing. And I thought, oh, we better do something. And I knew it would be so good for Oisín to get a chance to let his work have a bit of audience. And I'm really glad, Jerry, that you joined us. It's worked so well. What a nice
I'm glad to.
contrast. Like both of you, you know, there's more connecting your work than I thought when I suggested it. Yeah, and a lot of richness to get to know more about, really.
EY, everyone.
EY.
Right, good night.
Good night.
Now, I just wanted to thank you very much for the evening. I've enjoyed it,
You're
enjoyed it enormously, and thank both of your writers here. It was just very inspiring. Thank you.